we're going to be harvesting some of our potatoes, but also walking through storing them so that you have potatoes that will last all the way through until next year when growing season comes again. Now, when it comes to harvesting your potatoes, how do you know when to harvest them? Well, you'll have a couple of indications. Once your potatoes have completely died back on the top, so the vine part, this is our vine part, and you can see these are crispy critters. They are done. There is no more living. Then the potatoes underneath ground are not going to develop any more than the size that they already are. So that's one of your big indications. However, you can harvest potatoes, like baby potatoes or what we call new potatoes. You know, those smaller potatoes generally have a little bit thinner skin. Those you can harvest when the potato plant is still alive. So this is one of my last living above ground potato vines here. So what you do is you just want to come back, and you can use a little shovel, you can use a little clot, you can just use your hand. If your dirt is nice and loamy and you can get into there, then we're just going to dig back, and you can see right here, these are red fingerlings. So right there, I have got a great red fingerling potato. So I know that these potatoes are large enough to harvest. These are at harvestable size. So it's really just some indications by looking at the vine and then also just digging back, peeking beneath the soil and seeing. So you could, if you want to harvest all of the potatoes, if I knew I was done with these and I wanted to harvest all of these and get them out of the ground, then you can simply just grasp your vine right here and pull up. And you're going to get the majority of them. You may have a few that break off, and so you'll want to kind of sift through the soil, but you'll pull up the majority of them by doing that. However, I do not want to harvest all of these potatoes quite yet. These are still developing a little bit, so I'm just going to make sure that I'm covering them back up with the soil, because potatoes, as you probably know, we don't want to expose to the light for very long because they will start to turn green, and that green compound can actually be somewhat toxic. So we want to protect these potatoes from the light, make sure that they're well covered back up by the soil, and I'm going to let these guys continue to grow. I'm not actually going to harvest them right now. However, once your vines have died all the way back, these potatoes were planted about 6 weeks earlier than these ones were, so just a little bit of reference. So once they've died back, these are not going to grow and develop anymore underneath the ground. So you've actually got a couple of options. You can harvest all of these potatoes and then store them so that they last you throughout the winter months. When you're doing that, so we'll go ahead and kind of the same principle here. We're just going to go ahead and pull back the soil just so you can take a peek at these. So you can see here's where you're starting to get into potatoes. Now these I hilled up because they are an indeterminate variety, meaning that as long as there's soil around the base of the stem when they're in its living state, it will continue to develop potatoes. So these actually I'm going to have to dig down a lot further if I wanted to harvest all of these. And these are German butterball, which are a great storage potatoes. They are very delicious. They're one of my favorite varieties to grow. But I am actually going to, again, put the soil back here because I use a different method that works the best for us to keeping these potatoes fresh all year long until next spring. It is a little bit of a climate dependent though method. So if you live in an area that has fairly mild winters, now what I mean by mild is we got down to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, had 3 feet of snow, and this method still works. But if you have where you have really deep frosts where the ground freezes well beneath the surface and stays frozen, and or you get massive amounts of snow that's too deep to dig through and it doesn't melt, it just stays all the way throughout the winter, then you probably wouldn't want to do this with the majority of your harvest because you're not going to want to come out to harvest your potatoes and digging through massive amounts of snow, and or if the ground is froze too hard to get through it. And if the ground freezes too deep, it's going to actually freeze the potatoes. So the key to this method is making sure that the potatoes do not freeze, because if they freeze and then thaw, they're going to turn to mush. But we're going to insulate these guys. So I have got straw here, and I'm going to be covering these rows here with this straw. So I like to use straw. One of the key things is when you're buying your straw bales is you want to go through and look at it and make sure that you don't have a lot of seed heads. So what I mean by that is this one has a little bit. As I'm looking through here, that is not seed heads, that's just chaff. So this is what a seed head looks like. So you've all seen, grass seed or wheat. And so you want to make sure that you don't have too many of these This one actually does not have any live kernels, but sometimes you will have bales that have massive amounts of seed heads, and when you go like that on this part, you'll actually uncover full seeds and or wheat berries, because usually it's wheat. And so you want to make sure you're not getting them that have an overabundance of that, or you're going to have a lot more seeds introduced into your garden area. And that's also why I do not use hay. I don't use hay because here hay molds really fast, and it has a lot more seeds in it, and I don't want to deal with a lot of introduction of more seeds, which is then weeds, into my garden area. So for me personally, I prefer straw. You could, if you've got a lot of leaf matter in the fall and you have a way of chopping that up, you could do this with leaf matter, but our goal here is to really insulate and to cover this dirt, because one, I don't want the heavy rains to wash away the dirt and expose the potatoes, because again, they're going to be exposed to light, and then they're not going to last as long, and then they'll be exposed to those cold temperatures and freezing. This also just helps protect your soil from extra compaction and runoff. So I just go through, and you're going to want ideally about 6 inches, at least 4 to 6 inches of mulch. So you can see I've got, this is, I'm going to reach beneath there to the top of the soil level. I've got about 4 inches right here. So I'll go ahead and put another layer on once we get a little bit closer to our winter temps and full on frost. But what this does is it helps to insulate obviously potatoes so that they don't freeze. But then the straw is lightweight enough that it's pretty easy. It does not, usually once it starts to get rainy out, I don't have much of it blow away. We're pretty wet here, so it usually stays put. I don't lose very much of it, but it's light enough that I can come through easily with my fingers and pull it. So you can see that's how deep this is, right? I can pull this back to where my dead potato vine is, and then I can just dig down in here and harvest those potatoes as needed, and then just pull my straw back over top of that when I'm done. So it's a pretty easy and fast procedure. Now, when I know that we have a big snowstorm coming here, usually last year we got 3 feet of snow in a storm, but it only lasted for about a week, and then it had pretty much melted away, maybe a week and a half. So I just keep an eye out on the weather, and if I know we have a big snowstorm possible coming in, I'll come out and just harvest enough potatoes for what I think we'll want for that week or maybe the next 2 weeks, and then just leave the rest in the ground. Now, if you're like, we get snow and it lasts, or I don't think that I'm gonna be able to leave the potatoes in the ground and use this method, one other caveat, you wanna make sure your soil is well draining, because if we get a lot of rain, we get about 78 inches of rain annually here, which is a lot, but our soil is well draining. So if your soil's not well draining and you have a lot of standing water, they could rot. So that's another thing you wanna keep an eye on and make sure before trying this method. But it works really well, because when you're storing potatoes, if you're not storing them in a root cellar, this is basically using root cellar methods without building and having a full-on root cellar. Potatoes need a high amount of humidity or they shrivel up. You've probably experienced that. And if they're exposed to light, they'll start to sprout. That also has to do with temperatures. So it can be really hard to store potatoes long-term because they will start to sprout and then they shrivel up to nothing. This method has worked the best for us. These potatoes stay all the way through, usually until about April, when then the soil temperatures start to warm up enough, which is usually about 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Then they'll start to sprout in the ground. But by then it's perfect, because I'm ready to plant my next thing of potatoes. So I simply, the ones that have sprouted that we haven't harvested yet, I'll just dig those up, move them to a different area, because you do want to crop rotate with potatoes, not plant them in the same ground they were the year before, just to help mitigate disease issues. So I will pull all of those up, go through them really well, check out where the eyes are at if they needed to be cut to create more seed potatoes, and then I've got my seed potatoes and plant them for the following year. However, if you're like, we have a lot of snow, it freezes way too much, I can't leave them in the ground all winter, you can definitely harvest your potatoes. What you want to make sure you do when you harvest your potatoes, though, if you're planning on storing them, is you need to cure them. So number one, do not wash them. I know it's so counterintuitive, we want to wash the dirt off, but when you're curing things, you don't want to add in that extra moisture and drive it through the skin and down in there. So leave the dirt on. You're going to put them on a well-ventilated area in order to cure. So curing simply means we're drying out that outer layer of skin. It will harden up. Any nicks that are in there will harden up so that they don't continue to let bacteria in, excess moisture, oxygen, etc., and break down. So the curing part of doing your potatoes. You can do it on cardboard. Ideally, some type of screen is best though, because the screen has really good ventilation. Make sure that they're not too close together or touching so that you've got airflow all the way around them. Now, when you're curing your potatoes, ideally your humidity level is between 85 to 95%. I know it's very hard to control humidities, and most of us just have to go with whatever nature gives us as far as our humid. But you want to make sure that you're curing them where it is warm. And so ideally, I usually between like 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. You can go a little bit warmer than that, which is why if you do plan on pulling them up and curing them, you want to do so when you still have some good warm days and outside temperatures. If you've already reached the point where you don't have very much warm temperatures anymore, you can cure them indoors. I've cured ours beside the wood stove. I use that for curing our winter squash, garlic and onions, depending on what we're having weather-wise for the year. But then after that, for long-term storage, you have to get them out of light, and you need to keep them at a lot cooler. Ideally 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit storing temps for your potatoes, and 90% humidity, which is really hard to achieve in a house because most of our houses aren't quite that humid, and they will start to wrinkle up. You also want to make sure when you're storing your potatoes that you don't store them near onions. Onions produce ethylene gas, and that actually encourages and increases the sprouting factor of your potatoes. So make sure that if you are curing them and then storing them for long term, that you don't have them anywhere near your onion storage, because otherwise you're going to increase sprouting. So if you've ever noticed that, sometimes you'll have just on the, your shelves in your kitchen, you'll put a bag of potatoes, maybe have it near some onions, and if you've seen them sprout, that's probably what your culprit is. Now, of course, we're talking just doing regular like root cellar storage or just in the pantry storage, either in the ground or like we've just talked about curing and storing them. But with your potatoes, you also have the option of pressure canning them. So you could definitely pull all of these up and you could pressure can your potatoes. You can also do some different freezing methods. You can freeze dry them and you can dehydrate potatoes. So there's lots of ways to preserve them to ensure that you have potatoes all the way out throughout the whole year. And my new book, Everything Worth Preserving, goes through every single method, including root cellaring methods, walks you through with the recipes and the tutorials of all the ways that you can preserve potatoes at home. So highly encourage you to go and grab your copy of that. We'll have the link beneath this video. If you want more tips on getting your garden ready for the first frost and retaining as much of the harvest as possible throughout the winter months, go ahead and check out last week's video on gardening in October.